Welcome to our stress and burnout workshop. My name is Beth and I work for the Employee Wellbeing Service in Cwmtaf Morgannwg University Health Board. And this workshop is designed to help you understand a little bit more about stress and burnout, how we might experience these things, and learn ways of managing and responding to these difficult experiences and difficult emotions. During this session, there will be space for you to reflect. There'll be sort of questions and reflection points throughout the session. So do encourage you to grab some paper and a pen or something you can take notes on. And at different points, I will encourage you to kind of pause and reflect on certain things as we go through the session today. At the end, there will also be some reflection points. During the session, you might notice things coming up for you that maybe feel a bit uncomfortable or a bit upsetting. If that is true for you, at the end of the video, there will be some guidance on how you can seek some further support after watching this video. So let's get started then thinking about stress and burnout. In terms of what we're going to be looking at in this video, we're going to be looking at what we mean by stress. What is stress? What does it look like? What is burnout? What does that look like? And what's the difference between stress and burnout? We're going to have a little look at a really nice technique we can use to understand what things are impacting on our stress levels at the current time. And then we're going to look at ways that we can manage stress and burnout and build resilience moving forward. So, part one then, understanding stress and burnout. Firstly, thinking about what stress might look like or what stress might be. So, there's a really useful quote here from the Health and Safety Executive. Stress is defined as the adverse reaction people have to excessive pressures or other types of demand placed on them. This is distinct from normal workplace pressure, which can create a buzz and be a motivating factor. This adverse reaction can seriously affect the mental health of employees, for example, through anxiety or depression, and also have a significant effect on their physical health. So stress is a very common experience for human beings. All of us will experience pressure in the workplace. We'll all experience that kind of buzz or that motivating factor they describe there. Often what happens when stress starts to become difficult for us is that we start to experience that kind of adverse reaction. And essentially what tends to happen is we have more pressures on us than the ability to cope with, if that makes sense. So it's when we have that excessive pressure or demand placed on us and we don't feel we have the ability to cope with those pressures. So our stress response is essentially our body's fight or flight response, which is a very natural response. It's what our body is supposed to do when it's faced with stress or some kind of threat. And it's designed to protect us from danger or harm. So if I were to be walking in the woods, for example, and I come across a bear. I don't know how common that is in the UK, but I'm walking in the woods, I come across a bear. Hopefully, my brain would very quickly recognize that bear as a bit of a threat. It will alert me to that threat and it will put me in what we call fight or flight. Fight or flight is essentially a series of physical changes that happen that are designed to help me either fight the bear, run away from the bear, or somehow, in some way, physically respond to that dangerous situation. So our fight or flight response can be extremely helpful for us. It can be really useful in protecting us from danger and harm. And stress itself is not a bad thing. Sometimes stress can be useful even in a kind of workplace setting. It's when that stress starts to become unmanageable or it becomes kind of disproportionate to the situation that we're in. That's often when we start to experience the adverse reaction of stress that we often kind of think about. So some signs of stress then in our body, people will often experience a raised heart rate or changes in their heart rate when they're experiencing stress. People often experience a faster or shallower breathing. We often will sweat more, maybe we'll experience some muscle tension. Often people can notice this in a workplace setting. They sort of feel as they go through the day, the shoulders sort of rising up and up and up and up as we kind of increase that tension throughout the day. Might experience a dry mouth, nausea, headache, or needing to go to the loo more frequently. There are a lot of other things we can notice in the body, but these are some of the more common things that we might notice with that stress response. In terms of our thoughts, then, we might notice a lot of racing thoughts and maybe finding it difficult to switch off. We might have difficulty concentrating, so we might be finding it hard to focus on tasks in work, for example, or we might notice that because we're struggling to concentrate, we're maybe not remembering things as much, maybe we're making more mistakes than usual. We might find ourselves worrying quite a lot. Worrying tends to be quite future focused, maybe a lot of what if thoughts. So, what if this bad thing happens? What if that goes wrong? Stress can sometimes make us a bit hyper vigilant or hyper aware of things. So, that's where that worrying can sometimes come from. And we might be finding that we're focusing on the negatives a lot more. So when we are feeling stressed, it can sometimes be difficult for us to look for those positive things in the day. Again, if we're in that fight or flight response, that is our brain is trying to recognize potential dangers or potential threats. We're not really as likely then to notice the positive things or the good things that happen in the day. In terms of our behaviors, then we might start avoiding things. So maybe avoiding things that we know are likely to make us feel stressed, or maybe withdrawing from other people or activities. We might start drinking or smoking more as a way of trying to respond to the stress, a way of trying to relax. We might start eating more or less. Sometimes this is related to changes in appetite. So sometimes this is to do with how our body is responding to that stress, but sometimes it's more of a behavioral thing. So sometimes we might eat more because we're trying, again, similar to drinking or smoking more, we're trying to find something that will make us feel positive or something that will help us to relax. So a lot of people will eat out of stress and eat more when they're stressed. We might start snapping at people, being generally quite irritable, quite snappy at others, getting into more arguments, maybe. We might be quite physically restless, so we might be finding it difficult to sit still, maybe moving around a lot. And we might cry. A lot of people do have that response to stress where they feel quite overwhelmed and they might start crying or showing those kind of more visible signs of emotion then. In terms of the emotions we might feel kind of anxious or feel sort of on edge, maybe waiting for the worst to happen again, that kind of hyper vigilance or being sort of hyper aware. We might be quite irritable, maybe even angry. Sometimes we might experience a low mood as well. So these are some common signs of stress that we might notice. Again, these are kind of just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot that we can notice. Um, Now would be a really good time to pause the video, grab the pen and paper that you had earlier on, and maybe make a note of the things that you notice when you're feeling that stress. So what do you notice in the body, in your thoughts, in your behaviors, and in your emotions? Just take a minute to reflect on that. So, thinking now then about how we can assess our current levels of stress and what might be contributing to our stress, something that we use a lot in the wellbeing service is what we call the stress bucket analogy. The stress bucket analogy essentially is that all of us inside of us have this bucket and it will fill with stress during our day, during our week, during our lifetime. And some things that go in the stress bucket maybe just cause a couple of drops of water. Some things maybe cause a bigger gush of water to come into that bucket. So, what can be really helpful is considering the things that are filling our stress bucket. And this is something that you can do on a regular basis. So again, now would be a great time to grab that paper and pen, maybe pause the video for a little bit, and think first about what kind of things fill your stress bucket in work. Maybe even draw out a bucket on your piece of paper there and just write down everything that fills that stress bucket in work. Okay. Once you've done that, now maybe list all of the things that fill that stress bucket at home. And once you've done that, maybe think about the things that fill your stress bucket wider in society or maybe more global issues that fill that stress bucket. Okay, so hopefully now you have a kind of list of things that typically do help to kind of fill up that stress bucket for you. What can sometimes be really useful is reflecting on how many of these things we can actually control. Unfortunately, quite often, a lot of what fills that stress bucket is stuff that isn't really in our control. It's stuff that happens to us, and we can't always stop that or prevent that. Essentially, what we're kind of saying here is that stress is unfortunately a very normal part of life. It's a very normal part of being human. And we probably won't ever have a totally empty stress bucket. There'll usually be something in that bucket there that is causing that stress for us. What we want to try and do with this stress bucket is keep the water in the bucket at a manageable level, a level that we can hold, that we can carry, that we can kind of sustain over time. What we can learn to do if we're noticing that that bucket is getting too full, we can learn to poke holes in that bucket to kind of release some of the stress and some of the water from it. Before we think about what we can do to poke holes in that bucket, it might be worth, again, pausing the video here and just spending a few moments thinking about what you notice when that stress bucket level is going too high. So earlier on, you listed the sort of common things you notice coming up in your body, your thoughts, your behaviors, and also your emotions. What is it that tells you actually that stress bucket is getting too full now? What are those kind of early warning signs that you could maybe hopefully notice in future to keep that bucket at a manageable level? Okay, now it's worth having a little think about what we might be able to do to drain that stress bucket. What can we do to kind of poke holes in the bucket? Now, in part two of the session, we're going to be looking at some common tools and helpful tips that we can all use to kind of drain water out that stress bucket. But again, maybe just pause the video here and have a bit of a reflection about things that maybe already help to drain that bucket and poke holes in it. And again, think about work, think about at home, and think about in society or kind of globally. Okay. Thinking then about what might happen if our bucket stays full for too long. If that stress bucket remains too full for too long, maybe it starts to overflow, that's when we might start to experience burnout. So, thinking then about how we might define burnout. Burnout here is defined as a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. It's a syndrome conceptualized as resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So, we're talking here about experiencing high or excessive levels of stress for too long. Most of us can cope with a period of time where that bucket is too full, but we all have that kind of breaking point essentially where that bucket will start to overflow and it will become much more difficult for us to sustain that long term. So, that kind of prolonged stress. Burnout is essentially an exhaustion that happens when we've experienced too much stress for too long and we've not been able to manage it. Now, that's not necessarily designed as a bit of a judgment. We're not necessarily saying that if you've experienced burnout, it's entirely your fault that you couldn't manage that stress. That's not what we're necessarily saying. Sometimes the level of stress we're experiencing is just something that we're not going to be able to manage, that actually it's kind of maybe some of those more sort of abnormal or shock sort of situations in life, those situations that maybe put a whole gush of water into the bucket very quickly. So we're not necessarily attaching a judgment to that. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to manage certain life experiences and certain situations. What this graph is kind of demonstrating is that as our kind of level of stress increases, we can basically see either increases or decreases in our performance. So essentially what we're saying here is having absolutely no stress at all or having very low stress for a lot of us isn't actually that helpful. Stress is not always a bad thing, and often it is quite useful for us. When we have no stress or very little stress, often what we tend to experience is boredom. As that level of stress starts to increase, actually, we tend to see an improvement in our work. We then get to something that we call eustress, or you sometimes see this being called positive stress. Positive stress basically is the point at which we are kind of in our optimal work performance. It's that level of stress that kind of motivates us, that challenges us, that encourages us. And actually, it's that little bit of that buzz or that adrenaline that we often need to get through the day. So, positive stress is really useful for us. Unfortunately, as our level of stress continues to increase, we then start to see a bit of a decrease in our work performance until we eventually get to the point where we experience this kind of burnout. So essentially, the message is stress is not always bad for us. When it is at a manageable level for us, again, thinking about that stress bucket, when we can hold the bucket, we can carry the bucket, then actually that's when we're in that kind of useful level of stress. It's as that bucket starts to fill more and more that we start to experience fatigue, distress, and eventually that burnout then. Some signs of burnout we might notice then in terms of the physical side of things, the body sensations, we might notice kind of fatigue, tiredness, lack of energy, real kind of exhaustion physically sometimes. Despite being very tired, we might notice a lot of difficulty sleeping. So struggling to kind of fall asleep, maybe struggling to stay asleep properly or waking up very early. We might experience a loss of appetite. This is quite common with burnout. And we might notice kind of more of those physical stress symptoms that we talked about earlier on. In terms of our emotions, then again, anxiety, depression, anger, quite common. What some people really experience with burnout is feeling quite overwhelmed or even feeling quite numb or empty. So, not really having any emotions at all. Behaviorally, again, we might notice a lot of isolation or withdrawal from other people, avoidance of things that are likely to make us feel more stressed, maybe drinking or smoking more again. Thoughts on top of some of the thoughts that we talked about earlier on, we might notice that we're forgetting things quite a lot. Again, find it difficult to concentrate. So people often describe experiencing a kind of fuzzy head, feeling like it's difficult to think clearly or think straight when they're experiencing burnout, and sometimes having a lot of negative thoughts. In terms of work-related signs of burnout, then we might notice a reduced performance at work, maybe experiencing a lot of negative thoughts about work, really not wanting to go to work, and maybe a kind of real lack of motivation. It is important to point out that all of us from time to time have off days in work. All of us from time to time lack in motivation or aren't really performing at our best, or we have kind of negative thoughts about work, or we don't want to go into work. That's quite common. We all experience that from time to time. But if this is something that is going on for a longer period of time and it is accompanied by this kind of exhaustion, then it might be a sign of burnout. It's worth thinking about what our normal is as well. If we are, if we normally have a lot of negative thoughts about work, it might not be burnout. That might just be what our kind of normal is. So it's worth kind of thinking about when there's been a change in our typical or normal kind of behaviors or responses to things. So it's worth maybe again pausing the video here, maybe making a bit of a reflection point here about whether burnout is something that you are or have ever experienced, and whether you've ever experienced any of these kind of signs of burnout, and just kind of making a bit of a list of those. Okay, so now that we have maybe a bit of a clear understanding of stress and burnout, what they are, how they impact us, and we've had a little look at that stress bucket and the things that tend to kind of fill that bucket for us, we've also had a little look at what we can do to kind of poke holes in the bucket. Part two is all about learning how we can manage stress and burnout. So essentially, how can we have enough tools in our toolkit to poke holes in that bucket when we really need to release and manage some of that stress? So, first thing to talk about is relaxation and breathing exercises. These can be really helpful. So, first, thinking about breathing. We know when we're in that fight or flight response that we tend to breathe faster and shallower than usual in that kind of, again, that stress response. So, something that can be really helpful to counteract that is to practice what we call belly breathing. This is a way of taking slower, deeper breaths so that actually we're able, again, to counteract that fight or flight response. So, some people find it helpful to kind of wrap their head around what we mean by belly breathing. Some people find it helpful to place one hand on their chest and one hand down on their belly. And you might want to take a moment to do this with me now. And as you're sat there with one hand on the chest, one hand on the belly, for the next few moments, as you breathe in and out, try not to overthink the breath. It can happen, but try not to kind of overthink the breathing. As you're breathing in and out naturally, notice which of your hands tends to move most, whether it's that chest hand or whether it's that belly hand. Okay, so sometimes when people are experiencing stress or even things like anxiety as well, it tends to be that chest hand that's moving more. That chest hand is kind of showing that we're chest breathing. We're getting that faster, shallower breath. What we want to try and do when we're feeling stressed is get that belly moving more. So we're getting those kind of deeper, fuller breaths, and we're kind of slowing the breath down. So as you are sat with one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly, breathe in slowly through the nose and push your belly into your hand. And then breathe out slowly through the mouth and pull the belly back in again. So you breathe in through the nose, pushing the belly into the hand. Breathe out through the mouth, pull the belly back in again. Sounds very straightforward when I say it. This does sometimes take a bit of practice for people, so it's well worth giving this a bit of practice. One really important tip is to keep your shoulders and your chest nice and relaxed and still. Your chest will move slightly because there's air passing through it. But what some people do when they try and take a deep breath is they lift their chest or they lift their shoulders. Try and keep them nice and still and relaxed and just manipulate the belly. So pushing the belly into the hand, pulling it back in again. It's well worth practicing this technique. It can be a real game changer because it really can slow down that fight or flight response really quickly. It's worth when you're belly breathing, thinking about the speed of the breath as well. So we want to make sure we're slowing that breath back down. What some people practice is what we call 7-11 breathing. So this is where you would breathe in slowly for a count of 7, then breathe out slowly for a count of 11. The reason the out breath is longer than the in breath, so you're in for 7 but out for 11, is because that can be really helpful in managing things like panic as well. So if you're somebody that experiences panic attacks, having a longer out breath can be really helpful there. So that's belly breathing. Another technique that you can use for relaxation is what we call progressive muscle relaxation. This is a technique where you essentially work through the body one muscle group at a time, progressively tensing and then relaxing the muscles. The idea behind this technique is if we practice it enough, we can learn to recognize tension in our muscles and we can learn how to relax the muscles when we feel that tension rising. Again, with practice, this can be really, really helpful technique. With practice, some people can get to a point where they can literally relax on cue. So they notice tension in the body and just like that, they can relax the muscles again. The progressive muscle relaxation often takes about 20 to 30 minutes, so it's not something that we've included in this session, but there is a link in the description for this video to a progressive muscle relaxation guided track that you can use to practice this at home. There are some quicker relaxation techniques that you can use. So progressive muscle relaxation will take about 20 to 30 minutes. There are some quicker options. One of them that can be quite useful is the heavy shopping bags relaxation, I like to call it. So essentially with this one, what you're going to do is imagine that you have just come home from the supermarket and you've done a massive shop that's going to last you the whole month. And you've got all of the bags outside the car, you've gotten them out of the boot and you've got them on the floor outside the car, and you can't really be bothered to run in and out of the house several times for all these bags. It's raining, you just want to do it all in one go. Now, I'm not saying actually grab a load of heavy shopping bags and do this. That would not be good from a health and safety point of view, but you're just going to imagine this. And what you're going to do is you're going to bend your body down as if you're getting ready to pick those bags up. You're going to pretend that you're grasping hold of the handles of the bags. So what you're going to be doing then is tensing your fists. You're going to be making a fist and kind of tensing your hands and your arms to do that. Then you're going to imagine that you are lifting that really heavy load and you're going to slowly bring your upper body up. What you're going to notice is tension will start to form in your upper body. You're then going to imagine that you are walking into your house with these shopping bags. So walk to the nearest chair and really imagine that you're carrying that heavy load. So now you might notice tension in the legs, tension throughout the body as you're trying to carry this imaginary load. What you're going to do then, like I said, walk to the nearest chair and then you're going to flop down on the chair and pretend that you've just dropped the bags to your side. So where the progressive muscle relaxation is working through the body one muscle group at a time, that heavy shopping bags relaxation is all about tensing the muscles all at once and then relaxing them all at once. So it's a way of just holding all that tension and then letting it go. It's well worth trying some of these and practicing them because that's a really great way then of being able to use them when we really need them. Thinking about grounding then, this can be helpful from a kind of body sensations perspective, but also from our thoughts as well, kind of refocusing our mind a little bit. Quite often when we're stressed, we might notice a lot of thoughts about things that are not happening right now. Grounding can be a really great way of kind of bringing ourselves back to what's happening right now. A really useful technique for grounding is what we call the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. This is essentially where we use our five senses to again refocus our attention on the present moment. So the idea is we would kind of take a little bit of time to look around the space we're in and to think about our kind of internal experience as well. So we do have some time in the session to be able to go through that now. So if this is something that you'd like to do now, then feel free to kind of just find a comfortable position. And if you'd rather just kind of listen along and just see what the technique is all about, that's fine as well. But if you'd like to go along with it with this video, just find that nice comfortable position, just in whatever chair you're in. And just starting with our eyes open for a minute, just kind of looking around the space you're in. I'm picking out 5 things that you can see. And as you're picking out these 5 things you can see, really focusing your attention on them, really noticing what they look like, noticing shape, size, color, any patterns, any markings. If you're in a room that you're in quite regularly, is there anything you can focus on that maybe you've never noticed before? Perhaps a mark on the wall or an object you've never really paid attention to. Just picking out those 5 things that you can see. Some people find it helpful now to close their eyes for the next part, or maybe just lower the gaze, pick a spot on the floor to gaze at. And directing your attention now to what you can hear around you. And picking out 4 things that you can hear. Perhaps that's the sound of this video. Perhaps there are sounds coming from within the room, a clock ticking or a laptop whirring away. Perhaps there are sounds outside the room you're in or outside the building that you're in. Just picking out those 4 things you can hear. And again, really paying attention to what you can hear. How loud is the sound? Is it high in pitch or low in pitch? If it's a continuous sound, does it have any kind of rhythm or pattern? Noticing how you feel about the sound. Maybe any judgments you notice about the sound, whether you like it or not, whether it's annoying or not. And once you found those 4 things you can hear, moving your attention then to what you can touch or feel. So picking out 3 things you can touch or feel. Perhaps you can feel your feet touching the floor, your body touching the chair. Perhaps you can feel your clothes touching your skin. Or perhaps there are objects nearby that you can pick up and hold. Again, really thinking about how these things feel, the sensations you notice at these points of contact. Once you've found 3 things you can touch or feel, moving your attention to what you can smell. Perhaps you can notice smells coming from within the room, from near you, from outside of the room. Again, really noticing those aromas, noticing any judgments, whether you like them or not. Finally, finding one thing that you can taste. Perhaps you have a drink next to you you could take a sip of, or a snack that you could eat. Perhaps you just have a lingering taste in your mouth from something else that you've had. And then when you're ready, just gently bringing your attention back to the video, taking a few moments to resettle in your chair. So that's a really useful way that you can just use your senses to ground yourself back in the present moment. It doesn't really matter if you can't find 5 things you can see or 4 things you can hear, if all you can see are 3 things, then that's fine. It's not necessarily about achieving those numbers. It's just about using those senses to just bring us back to what's happening in the here and now. Another very quick grounding technique is really just sensing into our feet touching the floor. Some people find it really grounding to think about the fact that their feet are in contact with the floor and think about how that feels. So it's again worth practicing some of these grounding techniques so that you can use them at times of kind of higher stress as well. Another helpful technique, which is kind of similar to grounding, is what we call mindfulness. Grounding can maybe be seen as a bit of an informal mindfulness technique. Mindfulness is a really useful way of kind of noticing our present moment experience a little bit more, being maybe a bit more in touch with our kind of internal moment by moment experiences. So our kind of thoughts or our body sensations, our emotions. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what mindfulness is. The image that we have here on the screen, I think, is a really great way of describing mindfulness. So you can see there's 2 people here walking through a park. And the one person is walking through the park thinking about loads of things, thinking about the fact that the car needs an MOT, thinking about the stuff they need to get done in work today, thinking about all the bills that need to be paid, thinking about music that they heard recently, just thinking about loads of other stuff. And a lot of this stuff is stuff that's not happening right now in this moment. And while that person's thinking about all this stuff, they're totally missing the experience of that park and that walk that they're having. The other person in the image is walking through the park, thinking about the walk in the park. They're thinking about the sunshine on them. They're thinking about the nature around them, the trees around them. They're thinking about how their body feels moving through the park, what emotions are coming up for them. So they're the ones, the person that is kind of mindful, they're being in the moment with that experience. A lot of us go through life thinking about lots of stuff that isn't happening right now. A lot of us don't really spend a lot of time connecting with the present moment and connecting to our experience in that present moment. So, mindfulness is a technique that uses meditation and other informal practices to learn how to focus the mind on the present moment. Now, we offer a lot of mindfulness support within the Wellbeing Service. I'll explain where you can find out more information about our service at the end of the video. So, if you are interested in learning more about mindfulness, it's well worth taking a look at some of our resources on the website and maybe completing an access form to find out more and to register for one of our courses. Another helpful technique is to talk about how we're feeling or perhaps journal about how we're feeling. Talking can be really helpful. Talking to somebody else about how we're feeling and the stress that we're experiencing can really help. In some ways, when we are kind of talking to somebody else about what's in that bucket, it can help us take some of the water out of that bucket. Sometimes talking to somebody else can give us a different perspective of what we're experiencing or what we're feeling and can really help us to kind of make sense of our experience. Some people might not like to talk about how they're feeling with other people, and so actually journaling can be a really great way of getting those emotions out and getting those thoughts out without kind of talking to somebody else. Journaling is an incredibly personal experience. There's no right or way wrong to do it, but journaling essentially can help us to kind of externalize our thoughts and our feelings, monitor our feelings a little bit more, and generally express ourselves. So either kind of talking to somebody else or journaling or a bit of both, again, is just a really great way of kind of expressing and just making sense of how we're feeling. It's also important to think about getting a good night's sleep. We know that stress can have an impact on our ability to sleep, but if we are able to practice good sleep hygiene, getting a good night's sleep can really help to kind of reduce and manage our stress levels. We do have another recorded workshop on sleep, so if this is something that you particularly struggle with, it's well worth giving that one a watch. But just some kind of quick tips for here. It can be helpful to switch off devices around 30 to 60 minutes before bed. This is like mobile devices. That is because mobile devices do have a blue backlight on them that we know from a lot of research can stimulate the brain and make it more difficult for us to fall asleep. Some devices do now come with a blue backlight filter, so you can kind of click that option, and what will happen is it will change it, so it'll remove that blue backlight and hopefully then it won't disrupt your sleep as much. It is worth, however, thinking about what we're using that mobile device for. Some people do find that using things like social media or looking at the news and things like that can increase their stress levels. So if you know that that's something that you tend to experience with your phone or your mobile device, it might be worth switching that device off or putting it to one side before bed, even if you've got that blue backlight filter, just to avoid any kind of increases in stress levels later at night. Having some time before bed to relax and having a bedtime routine can be really helpful. So if you are going to switch off those devices 30 to 60 minutes before bed, maybe you could use that time to do something that you find relaxing or helpful. And if you do that every day, you make that a bit of a routine, that can be really useful. Probably most of us know the benefit of giving kids and children a bedtime routine. As adults, we tend to neglect that. But a routine is a really good way of saying to our brain, okay, it's time for us to start winding down, for us to go to sleep now. So again, in that 30 to 60 minutes before bedtime, if you are using that for some relaxation, do the same thing every night. So the brain starts to learn that routine and knows once you start doing it, okay, we're getting ready for bed now, time for me to wind down. Writing the to-do list for the following day can be really helpful, just so you're not kept up at night thinking about what you need to get done the next day. You can also practice what we call worry time. Worry time is essentially where we set aside a period of time, usually in the evening, and for that period of time, we can worry about whatever we want. But at the end of that worry time, we have to try and stop ourselves. This can be really, really helpful in kind of reducing the amount of time we spend a day worrying. So if my worry time is between 8 and 8:15 in the evening, for example, at 8:15 I have to get up, stop myself, maybe go do something else to kind of engage my brain. When I go to bed then later at night, let's say I go to bed at 10 o'clock, if the light goes out and I start worrying about things, I can say to myself, nope, this isn't my worry time. I will deal with this in tomorrow night's worry time. This does take a bit of practice, so it's worth kind of giving it a practice. It won't necessarily come straight away, but with practice, we can start to reduce our worrying to that period of time. This, as a side note, can also be really useful if you are the type of person that worries a lot during the day. Again, if you start to worry about something at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you can say, no, this isn't my worry time. I will deal with this in my worry time later on. So again, we're just kind of reducing the amount that we're kind of worrying through the day, and we're learning to delay our worries, which can be quite helpful in managing worrying overall. If possible, try to go to bed and wake up at roughly the same time each day. If you work shifts, this might not be possible, but if not, it can be really helpful to have a solid routine of going to bed and waking up at about the same time each day, even on weekends. Try not to rely on napping regularly. Relying on napping regularly can sometimes kind of make our routine very different. Our body really relies on routine. So if we're napping during the day, our body isn't necessarily going to realize that it still needs to sleep at night. So it's important that we don't rely on that regularly. Try not to consume caffeine or alcohol late in the day. Both caffeine and alcohol can have an impact on our ability to get a good night's sleep. Alcohol is quite interesting. A lot of people will notice they fall asleep quicker after having a drink. However, the quality of sleep that we get is drastically reduced when we have had alcohol. So although we might fall asleep quicker, after that point, the quality of sleep that we're getting is not going to be enough to kind of help us feel fully rested. Caffeine usually takes about 6 to 8 hours to get out of our system. So if you were going to go to bed about 10 o'clock at night, you probably wouldn't want any caffeine after about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, just to make sure that you've got long enough to get that caffeine out of your system. Try and get some exercise during the day. We know that getting exercise during the day can help with sleep. What we don't want to do is do high intensity exercise too close to bedtime, just because that can get us all wired and it can be harder to kind of unwind for sleep then. So try and do any intense exercise earlier in the day if possible. Try not to eat too late, particularly not eat a kind of big meal too late. Equally, we don't want to go to bed hungry though. So having a light snack before bed can help. Try not to eat anything too heavy or too big before bed, just because your body does need to digest and process that, and it's harder to do that while you're asleep. And try and keep your bedroom just for sleep. There is an obvious exception to this rule, but other than that, we want to try and keep that room just for sleep. If we work in our bedroom, or we watch TV in our bedroom, or maybe we read in our bedroom, our brain might start to associate that space with all those other activities, and it might not associate that space with actually falling asleep. So it's important to keep that environment an environment for sleep. Getting some exercise can be helpful. We talked then about how exercise can be helpful in sort of helping with sleep, but it can also help to improve stress, anxiety, and depression, and can generally boost our mood. So exercise is a really, really useful tool. This doesn't necessarily have to mean joining a gym or anything like that if that's not your style. It can just mean going out and going for a walk around the block each day. Just getting the body moving can be really helpful in improving our overall emotional well-being and kind of managing stress. Take some time out for hobbies, doing things that you enjoy. These can kind of boost our mood. They give us a bit of a positive distraction from difficult things that we're experiencing, and they help to generally top up the batteries as well. Hobbies are great because essentially it's something that we do just for the sake of enjoyment. It's not a responsibility. It's not something that we have to do or we're forced to do. It's something that we get to do just for ourselves, just for the sake of enjoying it. So having some space in our week where we can engage with some hobbies can be a really helpful tool, not just for managing stress, but for managing our overall emotional well-being. Having positive social contact is really important. Feeling connected to people around us can really help to support our well-being, and having people around us we can talk to and talk about how we're feeling with can be really helpful. So it's about making an effort to maintain our social contact with loved ones, friends, and colleagues. And taking care of our body can be a really helpful way of managing stress as well. So, avoiding too much alcohol or avoiding other substances, avoiding too much caffeine. Caffeine can actually mimic a lot of the signs of stress and things like anxiety. So, trying not to kind of overdo it with the caffeine can help. Getting outside for some fresh air during the day is one that a lot of us neglect, but can be really helpful for our body. Making sure we're staying hydrated, drinking enough water, maintaining a balanced diet, and eating regularly through the day. All of these things are kind of small things we can do to look after our body, but actually also go a long way in helping us support our emotional well-being and our stress levels as well. In terms of managing burnout, then, firstly, we might want to check in with ourselves regularly. Is my stress bucket getting too full? What might help me drain some water out of that today? Make sure that you are taking breaks in work, you're taking your annual leave, and that you're kind of setting and maintaining healthy boundaries around work. Try to maintain a good work-life balance, try and avoid too much overtime where you can, making sure you're getting enough sleep, scheduling that downtime or time for hobbies, and asking for help if you need it. Not necessarily just around kind of emotional well-being, but with practical things. If you've got too much on in work, asking for help from colleagues can really help to kind of avoid higher levels of stress and burnout. So just encourage you at the end of the session now to spend a bit of time reflecting on the session, maybe asking yourself what has resonated with you most during the session, what you've noticed about your well-being throughout the session, and maybe one thing that you can do to support your well-being after the session today. If you do want any more information on the services that we offer within the Wellbeing team, you can find this on our website, ctmuhb.nhs.wales/staff/employee wellbeing. There's also a link to our access form there. So if you would like to access any of our services, you can complete that form through the website there. We also have an employee assistance program called Vivup. Vivup provides a free 24/7 telephone helpline and free counselling for all staff. So if you do feel like you need to talk to somebody after this session today, you can give them a call on 03303 800 658.